On a quiet suburban street in Sydney, a young American woman walked toward a train station and vanished without a trace. No witnesses. No evidence. Decades later, her disappearance remains one of Australia's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Barbara Brown was born in 1955 in Texas, United States. At the time she disappeared, she was 22 years old. She was described as a Caucasian woman with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a height of 5 feet 3 inches. Friends remembered her as warm, approachable, and trusting, someone who believed strongly in the kindness of people she met. That belief shaped how she moved through the world and how she chose to travel. Barbara developed a love for independent travel at a young age. She viewed hitchhiking not as a risk, but as an opportunity to experience places more intimately and connect with strangers. Despite repeated warnings from others about the dangers involved, she remained confident in her judgment. Those close to her said she was careful but optimistic, guided by instinct rather than fear. Before arriving in Australia, Barbara spent months traveling across New Zealand, Tasmania, and Victoria. She carried her life on her back, relying on rides from passing motorists and temporary stays along the way. During part of this journey, she traveled with a Canadian woman named Anne-Marie, referred to in letters sent home. By the time Barbara reached Sydney, the two women separated and continued their travels independently. Barbara chose to move forward alone, continuing the same travel style that had carried her safely across multiple countries. She believed travel was best lived freely. Barbara Brown arrived in Australia after months of independent travel and soon formed a close relationship with Chris Bygum. They met in late 1977 while both were holidaying in New Zealand. Chris was working as a lecturer in Melbourne, and Barbara later traveled there to spend time with him. Those who knew them described the connection as immediate and warm, reflecting Barbara's open nature and ease with new people. After her time in Melbourne, plans were made for Barbara to continue north. Chris's brother, Tony Bygum, and Tony's wife, Peta, drove Barbara from Melbourne to Sydney. She stayed one night at their home on Chilworth Close in the suburb of Beecroft. It was a brief stop, intended only as a pause before the next stage of her journey. During that visit, both Chris and Tony warned Barbara about the risks of hitchhiking in Australia. They expressed concern for her safety and urged caution. Barbara listened, but remained confident. She had hitchhiked extensively through New Zealand without incident and believed Australia would be no different. Barbara explained her plans clearly. She intended to travel north toward Queensland and later cross the country to Perth. Her route was flexible, guided by opportunity rather than strict schedules. The following morning, she prepared to leave Beecroft and continue her journey alone. Nothing about her plans suggested she expected danger or disruption ahead then there. On Friday, May 17, 1978, Barbara Brown left the Beecroft home where she had spent the night. The house was located on Chilworth Close, a quiet suburban street. That morning, Barbara was preparing to continue her travels north through Australia, following the same independent path she had taken throughout her journey. Peta Bygum, who was at the house, watched Barbara depart from the balcony. Barbara walked down the street, turned the corner, and disappeared from view. This was the last confirmed sighting of her. She was heading in the direction of the local train station, intending to continue her journey without delay. It is believed that Barbara planned to travel by train before hitchhiking further north. One possible stop was Hornsby, an area known at the time as a common starting point for hitchhikers traveling up the coast. Her destination was Queensland, with longer-term plans to eventually cross the country to Perth. When Barbara was last seen, she was wearing a blue jacket and light blue jeans. She was carrying a yellow backpack containing an orange tent, with a blue sleeping bag tied to the outside. After leaving Beecroft that morning, Barbara Brown was never seen or heard from again, and no confirmed trace of her movements was recorded after that point. The disappearance occurred during daylight hours and was not witnessed by anyone else nearby at that time. In early June 1978, concern over Barbara Brown's disappearance intensified and drew wider attention. News reports began to circulate, prompting her father, Ronald Brown, a Shell Oil executive based in Houston, Texas, to travel to Australia in search of his daughter. He arrived determined to gather information and appealed directly to the public for help. New South Wales police organized a press conference to address the growing concern. Ronald Brown appeared alongside Barbara's Australian boyfriend, Chris Bygum. Together, they asked anyone who had seen Barbara or had information about her movements to come forward. Their appeal was reported in newspapers and reached audiences beyond Sydney. Following the press conference, police received dozens of reported sightings. Tips were called in from various locations, but none could be confirmed or supported with evidence. Investigators were unable to establish a reliable trail after Barbara left Beecroft. No belongings were recovered, and no witnesses came forward who could verify seeing her after that morning. As days turned into weeks, the lack of progress became clear. Despite media coverage and public appeals, the investigation produced no solid leads. Eventually, with no new information emerging, Ronald Brown returned to the United States. Barbara's disappearance remained unresolved, and the early surge of attention began to fade. At the time, authorities confirmed there was no evidence indicating her whereabouts or what had happened next to investigators then available. After the initial search efforts, questions remained about how the investigation was handled. Chris Bygum later stated that his contact with New South Wales police was limited to a single phone conversation. He was never asked to provide a formal written statement about Barbara Brown's disappearance, despite being her partner at the time. Peter Bygum also said she was never interviewed by police. She had known Barbara personally and was present at the Beecroft home during Barbara's final hours. According to her account, no officer contacted her to record what she had seen or heard. Tony Bygum did provide a statement during the original investigation, but decades later he could no longer recall precise details, describing how time had blurred his memory. Another unresolved issue involved Barbara's Canadian travel companion, Anne-Marie. It remains unclear whether police ever managed to speak with her after Barbara disappeared. There is no confirmed record showing that investigators traced Anne-Marie's movements or formally documented her account of their travels together. These gaps left significant portions of Barbara's final days undocumented. Without comprehensive statements from those closest to her, investigators were left with limited information. Over time, the lack of follow-up contributed to the case losing momentum, leaving critical questions unanswered and reinforcing how easily a disappearance could fade without sustained investigative attention. This absence of detail continues to define unresolved nature of the case. After the early months passed, public attention surrounding Barbara Brown's disappearance gradually declined. Newspaper coverage became less frequent, and the urgency that marked the initial search faded. Without new evidence or confirmed sightings, her case slipped from headlines and into obscurity. For those who knew her, the absence of answers remained deeply personal. Friends remembered Barbara as energetic, optimistic, and eager to connect with others. She was described as someone who trusted easily and approached travel with enthusiasm rather than fear. Those memories stood in contrast to the growing silence around her disappearance. As years passed, there were no major developments to revive public interest. Barbara's name was rarely mentioned, and her story became unfamiliar to newer generations. Unlike other cases that remained active through discoveries or arrests, hers remained unresolved and quiet. The lack of continued attention meant fewer opportunities for renewed investigation. Potential witnesses aged, memories faded, and records became harder to access. While her disappearance was never solved, it also was no longer widely discussed. For Barbara's family and those who remembered her, time did not provide closure. Instead, it reinforced the reality that her disappearance had become a forgotten case, unresolved and absent from public awareness. For decades, Barbara Brown's disappearance remained largely unexamined, until renewed attention emerged from within the local community. Jolien Deller, a teacher living near Beecroft, became aware of the case and was troubled by how little was remembered. She believed the circumstances deserved renewed scrutiny and felt compelled to act. Deller was joined by her friend and neighbor Georgia Cameron, a copywriter. Together, they began researching Barbara's disappearance independently. Their efforts focused on preserving memory rather than drawing conclusions. They contacted media outlets, searched archived newspapers, and reviewed historical records to better understand what had happened in 1978. Deller explained that her motivation was partly personal. As a child, she had been the victim of multiple crimes and felt justice had been limited. Seeking answers for Barbara became a way to pursue justice for someone whose case had been overlooked. The two women also searched the National Library of Australia's Trove database, attempting to trace people Barbara may have met during her travels. They worked to locate former friends, acquaintances, and anyone connected to her journey. Their persistence brought Barbara Brown's story back into public discussion. Though no answers were uncovered, their advocacy ensured the case was no longer entirely forgotten. Their work continued quietly, driven by care, patience, and commitment. In 2019, skeletal remains were discovered in bushland near Beecroft, close to the M2 motorway. The location drew attention because of its proximity to where Barbara Brown was last seen more than 4 decades earlier. Some media reports at the time suggested the remains were human and possibly Aboriginal, but no official identification was made. The remains were not publicly linked to any missing person case. Authorities did not confirm a connection to Barbara Brown, and no forensic match was announced. The remains remain officially unidentified, leaving their origin and identity unresolved. For those researching Barbara's disappearance, the discovery raised difficult questions. The closeness of the site to Beecroft made it significant, even without confirmation. Jolyon Deller and Georgia Cameron noted the coincidence, but acknowledged that no evidence connected the remains to Barbara. There is no public record confirming whether Barbara's DNA, fingerprints, or dental records are available for comparison. To date, no unidentified remains found in Australia have been matched to her. If Barbara Brown were alive today, she would be in her late 60s. Her disappearance remains unresolved, with no confirmed trace of her movements after May 17, 1978. Authorities continue to encourage anyone with information to contact police, as the case remains open and unanswered.